Constructors are not the only way to run code as part of the initialization of our classes. We have another mechanism called initialization blocks. What they allow us to do is create code that's shared across all our constructors. And what they do is they run the code as if that code were placed at the very beginning of each constructor. Let's revisit our flight class for a second. Remember that our flight class has some fields in it. We know we have that passenger fields. I'm going to go ahead and look at another field here called flight number that we'll talk about in a second that I've added. And of course we have our seats field. I'm going to introduce another new field here called flight class. And the idea here is that flight number and flight class are two different ways to identify a flight. So a flight's either created with an individual number or it's created with an individual character as a flight class to kind of group it somehow. Now remember that constructor that we wrote earlier. It took no arguments and it set seats to 150 and our passengers were set to 0. Now we've learned a lot since we originally wrote this constructor. We know that passengers will automatically be set to 0, so we don't need to have that code here. We also know that we can initialize the value of the seats field right up there in the declaration. So we'll go ahead and move that up there, and we no longer need it inside of our constructor. So now let's add two more constructors. One that accepts our flight number, so we'll go ahead and initialize that. And another one that accepts our flight class, and that initializes the flight class field. Now as we're enhancing our class, let's go one step further. In addition to having these different ways to identify our flights, let's keep track of the seats a little more closely. Right now, all we have is this ability to have the number of seats. And earlier we kind of just kept count of how many passengers we had. Let's kind of advance this a little bit and say, let's keep track of if each individual seat is available. And we've got this new array here, is seat available, that's an array of Boolean. Right now, if we just declare this array of Boolean, all the values are going to default to false. We, of course, don't want to have all the seats available set to false. That would imply that they were unavailable. Right? We want them to be available or set to true. So now, based on what we know so far, the way we would do that is we would go to our no argument constructor here. We would go ahead and allocate out the array for is seat available. And then what we would do is loop through each one and then set each one to true. Right, now that's a reasonable thing to do. What we do, of course, is that in each of the other constructors, we would call up to that constructor. Right, so our constructor based on flight number and our constructor based on flight class would both call up to the no argument constructor. Right, and that's a reasonable thing to do. But in cases like this where we have code that we want to share across all the constructors, that's a perfect place to use initialization blocks. And all we have to do is take that code that we want to share and place it within brackets outside of any method or constructor. Let's take our no argument constructor and take all the code out of it and we'll move it down. So now it has no actual code inside of it. And then we'll take that code that we want to run and wrap that in brackets. Notice there's no constructor name here, there's no method name, it's just the brackets and the code. That turns that code into an initialization block. And it will automatically be executed as if it's at the beginning of each one of our constructors. So our flight number based constructor no longer needs to chain up to another constructor, as well as our flight class constructor. No matter how someone creates this class now, the code to set up our is seat available will always run because it's in that initialization block. So it's a great way to share that code across constructors. It's really useful in something we're going to talk about later called anonymous classes. Another thing just to note is if you do put multiple initialization blocks in a class, they're executed in the order they're encountered from the top. I would be really careful about that because that's really easy to get out of hand, but just something to be aware of.